I like history, and I definitely like watching time-lapse videos of changing borders. It's why I play basically any 4X game at all. I'm not there for the battles, for the faction management, I'm just there to watch different areas change colors and all the border gore. But, depending on the time period you're looking at, while they can be interesting, informative, and even useful tools, in some cases these kinds of maps can obscure more than they show. For example, they can give an impression of the way the world is structured, which implies the presence of more modern ideas of how borders and nation-states work that didn't really exist in the past. The idea of this specific group owned this territory which went nicely up against this other territory that this other group owned didn't quite reflect the reality of the world in a lot of history, even just ignoring things like border disputes today. When I was bored on Twitter looking at some of these maps, I started thinking about how this applies to some aspects of Star Wars as well. I've actually seen a few complaints about this kind of thing with, for example, the Rakatan Infinite Empire going across so much of the galaxy, or how the unknown regions being unknown doesn't make any sense because they're right there, or how the High Republic setup with how much or little territory is known or controlled doesn't work. But I think there's a few things which these complaints ignore. The first thing is that a map which shows galactic territorial control as a big solid block of color will not really be able to effectively convey one of the most important elements of this, which is density. In many ways, when it comes to Star Wars maps or Star Wars territory, density is more important than location. Now, I use big colored swaths of territory when I'm doing lore videos myself as well. In most contexts, they are very helpful and get the point across. But just because the Republic of thousands of years ago and the Republic of modern Star Wars times may look like they control what appears to be similar amounts of territory in the galaxy, you've really got to start thinking about specific planets within those areas. While some specifics may change from story to story, Star Wars is actually pretty consistent at describing how hyperlanes work at a general level at least. It's really not raw distance that matters when you're able to travel at the speed of Star Wars ships. It's how clear and accessible the hyperlanes are. Basically, think of all the potential astronomical blockages as being rough terrain, where some kind of little space pebbles exist and would obliterate your ship. Most galactic exploration and settlement happens based on proximity to some pretty large and pretty clear hyperlanes, and planets like Coruscant ended up rising to prominence the way they did because of where they're situated related to these cleaner, more well-mapped lanes. I actually did a video focusing on this element of Coruscant in particular in the past, which I'll link to in the cards here. Even in older times, these stretched from basically one end of the galaxy to the other, so there was always some level of continuity of galactic civilization from the deep core to the outer rim. What took longer was getting the smaller branches that go deeper into space off of those. Earlier on, the Republic was more in the core, which was definitely faster and easier to move between because of how that mapping occurred, but contact was still more common and at a bigger scale with groups like the Hutts and Tianese, farther out from the core but along easier hyperspace lanes, than between those core planets and other technically more nearby but harder to reach planets. You can also think of this like how waterways often worked historically. During a lot of history, places with better access to waterways, which were the easiest means of travel, could be more connected than places which may be closer geographically, but where travel by water specifically wasn't as easy. In some ways this is still true today. In Star Wars you can think of those hyperspace lanes as waterways, and the other areas as being the rougher, less wet terrain I mentioned earlier. For the unknown regions, it's the difference between going down the river or passing over a mountain. To maybe carry the metaphor too far, there are groups within the unknown regions which have found little rivers through the mountain's valleys, allowing them to map it out a bit more internally. But especially in Timothy Zahn's Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy and New Canon, the barriers to movement are made a lot more clear and explicit. He even introduces Force-sensitive navigators for hire, called Pathfinders, who allow the individuals and factions in the unknown regions, referred to internally as the Chaos, to navigate the constantly changing astronomical terrain more easily. So when you're looking at these maps and start thinking nothing changed in 24,000 years of galactic exploration and history, look past the solid colors for territory and try to think more about how many occupied planets are between some of those more famous ones. It's less about going further out towards the rim and more about going deeper beyond the easiest hyperspace lanes. That's how you end up going from what's probably in the order of a couple hundred major planets and colonies in the earlier periods to thousands or even millions of occupied planets in the later days of the Republic. The massive economic and military power of the Empire even allowed them to take this matter into their own hands to a certain extent. though for far more nefarious purposes. Endor and the sector in which it's located, the model sector, were actually considered quite remote to the point of being almost impenetrable without significant effort or time. This made it ideal to secretly build a massive superweapon in, but also made it difficult to do the actual building. In order to circumvent this, the Empire constructed a giant secret space canal, essentially, known as the Sanctuary Pipeline, functioning as a major specific-purpose hyperspace lane between Sullust and the more major Rimmer trade route all the way over to Endor, though they were only able to do this by widening a much smaller, less reliable known run called the Silvestri Trace. I did another video on that earlier too, which I'll link to as well. That's going to do it for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of what space actually is like in Star Wars. If so, and you'd like to see more boring videos like this, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments as well if there's another topic you'd like to see me cover. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.